On the morning of November 10th, 1898, 2,000 armed white men marched through the streets of Wilmington, North Carolina. They carried Winchester rifles, Colt revolvers, and even a Hotchkiss rapid-fire gun capable of firing over 400 rounds per minute. The sound of their boots echoed off the brick buildings lining Market Street as they moved eastward with military precision. This wasn't a mob. This was an army. They weren't there to read the newspaper. They were there to destroy it. At the corner of 7th and Nunn Streets stood a modest two-story brick building that housed the Daily Record, which proudly advertised itself as the only black-owned daily newspaper in the world. The building was small, unremarkable from the outside, but inside those walls, something revolutionary had been happening. A black voice speaking truth to power in an era when such speech could cost you your life. By mid-morning, that building would be reduced to smoking ruins. By nightfall, official records would count 14 dead, but modern historians estimate as many as 60 black residents were killed, with some accounts suggesting the toll may have reached into the hundreds. Over 2,100 more, roughly 10% of the city's entire population, would flee Wilmington forever, abandoning homes, businesses, entire lives built over generations. American democracy would suffer a wound so deep that the truth would stay buried for over a century. Textbooks would call it a race riot. Newspapers would blame black residents for the violence. The perpetrators would pose for photographs in front of the burning newspaper office, smiling, proud of what they'd done. This is the story of how one newspaper editorial provided the excuse for America's only successful coup d'etat. But to truly understand what happened in Wilmington on that November morning, we need to go back 3 years, to when two brothers decided to do something audacious. They decided to print the truth. In 1895, Alexander Lightfoot Manley and his brother Frank established the Daily Record in Wilmington. It wasn't the first black newspaper in America. Frederick Douglass had published the North Star decades earlier. By the 1890s, black newspapers existed in cities across the country, serving communities that white newspapers either ignored or actively maligned. But the Daily Record was different. It was a daily newspaper, not a weekly or monthly publication. In an era when most newspapers, white or black, came out once or twice a week, the Manley brothers were publishing every single day, providing fresh news, commentary, and community information to Wilmington's black residents. The masthead declared it the only Negro daily in the world, and as far as anyone knew, that was true. The paper covered local news, national politics, church events, school activities, business opportunities. It ran advertisements for black-owned shops and professional services. It documented the achievements of a community that was doing something remarkable in the post-Reconstruction South. It was thriving. Alex Manley, the editor, was born on May 13, 1866, near Raleigh, North Carolina. His birth came in the chaotic year immediately following the Civil War's end, when 4 million formerly enslaved people were trying to build lives in freedom. Alex's personal history embodied the complicated legacy of slavery and its aftermath. His grandfather was Charles Manley, who had served as North Carolina's governor from 1849 to 1851, a respected white politician from a prominent family. His grandmother, Corinne, was enslaved. That meant Alex was born free in legal terms, but carried in his veins the reality of slavery's brutality and the hypocrisy of a system where powerful white men enslaved women, fathered children with them, and then maintained the fiction that these relationships didn't exist or somehow didn't count. Alex was light-skinned, light enough that in the right circumstances, he could pass for white. This detail would later save his life. He attended Hampton Institute in Virginia, one of the premier schools for black students, where he received the education that would make him an articulate, powerful voice for his community. When he returned to North Carolina with his brother Frank to establish the Daily Record, Alex Manly wasn't just starting a business. He was claiming a space in public discourse that black people were supposed to accept they had no right to occupy. To understand why a newspaper mattered enough to spark a coup, you have to understand what Wilmington was in 1898. This wasn't some small rural town where black people were barely scraping by under the boot of white supremacy. Wilmington was North Carolina's largest city, a thriving port where ships came and went carrying cotton, timber, and naval stores. The population was approximately 20,000 people, and 56% of them were black. 11,000 black residents to 8,500 white residents. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was what those numbers meant in terms of power. Black men in Wilmington didn't just live there. They governed. 10 of the city's 26 police officers were black men, wearing badges, carrying authority, walking beats, keeping order. Try to imagine that. Try to imagine being a white supremacist in 1898 and seeing a black police officer, knowing he had the legal authority to arrest you. Black men served as city treasurer, controlling public funds. A black man served as city jailer, literally holding the keys. A black man served as coroner, deciding causes of death, writing official reports. Black men sat on the board of aldermen, making laws that everyone, including white people, had to follow. Black literacy rates in Wilmington exceeded those of white residents. Let that sink in. Black people were more educated, on average, than white people in the same city. Black-owned businesses weren't just surviving, they were prospering. Wilmington had black doctors, black lawyers, black teachers, black shop owners, black entrepreneurs. This wasn't what white supremacists had promised the South after the Civil War. This was integration. This was black power. This was democracy actually working for black people. And white supremacists across North Carolina looked at Wilmington with a mixture of fear and fury. How did this happen? How did black residents of a southern city in the 1890s achieve real political power? The answer was something called fusion. In the mid-1890s, an unusual political coalition emerged in North Carolina. White populists, mainly farmers who felt exploited by wealthy elites and big business interests, joined forces with Republicans, which at that time included most black voters and some white voters who had remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War. This fusion coalition wasn't based on racial harmony or progressive ideals about equality. It was a practical alliance between groups who shared common economic interests and a common enemy in the Democratic Party, which represented the old plantation elite and big business. But whatever the motivations, fusion delivered real results for black citizens. In 1896, the Fusionists elected Daniel L. Russell as governor of North Carolina, the first Republican to hold that office since Reconstruction ended in 1877. Fusionists controlled the state legislature, and critically, Fusionists controlled Wilmington's city government. Mayor Silas P. Wright was a white Republican. The Board of Aldermen had several black members. Black men held appointed positions throughout city government. The next city elections weren't scheduled until March of 1899. This multiracial democracy, however imperfect and fragile, represented everything white supremacists had fought the Civil War to prevent. Black political power achieved through legitimate elections, protected by law, impossible to dismiss as a temporary aberration or federal occupation. This was black people and white people cooperating to govern a major southern city, and it was working. But 300 miles to the south, a white woman was giving speeches that would eventually help destroy what Wilmington had built. Rebecca Latimer Felton was born on June 10, 1835, into a wealthy slave-owning family in Georgia. She married William H. Felton, who was a physician, Methodist minister, and politician. Rebecca Felton became a prominent advocate for women's education, temperance, and women's suffrage. She wrote newspaper columns. She gave speeches. She advised her husband during his political career. In another context, she might be remembered as an early feminist. But Rebecca Felton was also a virulent white supremacist who advocated for lynching with the same passion she advocated for women's rights. On August 11, 1897, Felton stood before the Georgia State Agricultural Society in Tybee Island, Georgia, and delivered a speech that dripped with hatred. She spoke about protecting white women from what she called the ravening human beasts. She argued that if courts and churches wouldn't protect white womanhood, then citizens had to take matters into their own hands. Her exact words were, "When there is not enough religion in the pulpit to organize a crusade against sin, nor justice in the courthouse to promptly punish crime, nor manhood enough in the nation to put a sheltering arm about innocence and virtue, if it needs lynching to protect woman's dearest possession from the ravening human beasts, then I say lynch, 1,000 times a week if necessary." The crowd applauded. Newspapers across the South praised her courage. White politicians endorsed her views. Throughout 1898, her speech would be reprinted again and again in Democratic newspapers, each printing further inflaming white panic about black men supposedly threatening white women. The speech wasn't really about protecting anyone. It was about creating a justification for racial terrorism. It was about painting black men, particularly educated and successful black men, particularly black men with political power, as inherently dangerous predators who posed an existential threat to white civilization. The goal was to make violence seem not just acceptable, but necessary, even heroic. Rebecca Felton would live until January 24, 1930, long enough to become the first woman to serve in the United States Senate, appointed to fill a vacancy for a single day in 1922. She would never apologize for encouraging lynching. She would never acknowledge the role her words played in Wilmington's destruction. Throughout 1898, white newspapers across North Carolina reprinted Felton's speech over and over. The Raleigh News and Observer, the Charlotte Observer, the Wilmington Messenger, dozens of other papers, all hammering the same message: black men are dangerous. White women need protection. Lynching is justified. Vote Democratic to restore white supremacy. But this wasn't random or spontaneous. This was coordinated. Early in 1898, before Manley ever published his editorial, Democratic Party leaders held a meeting in New Bern, North Carolina. Furnifold Simmons, chairman of the state Democratic Party, sat down with Josephus Daniels, editor of the News and Observer, and Charles Aycock, a powerful political orator. They weren't meeting to discuss policy positions or campaign strategies in the normal sense. They were meeting to plan what they openly called a white supremacy campaign. Simmons, born in 1854, had previously lost an election to a black candidate, and the humiliation had never left him. He was determined to restore Democratic and white control of North Carolina by any means necessary. At that meeting in New Bern, Simmons laid out his strategy. He called it a three-pronged attack. He would recruit men who could write, men who could speak, and men who could ride. The men who could write were led by Josephus Daniels. Born on May 18, 1862, Daniels never knew his father, who died before Josephus was born. His mother worked as a postmistress in Wilson, North Carolina, supporting the family alone. Josephus grew up with a chip on his shoulder and an ambition to matter, to be important, to wield influence. In 1894, with financial backing from Julian Carr, a wealthy white supremacist tobacco magnate, Daniels acquired controlling interest in the Raleigh News and Observer. The paper became his weapon. Throughout the summer and fall of 1898, the News and Observer published a relentless stream of inflammatory editorials, fake news stories, and viciously racist front-page cartoons. The cartoons were created by Norman Jennett, a 21-year-old artist who went by the nickname Samson Huckleberry. Jennett's cartoons depicted black people as apes, as buffoons, as dangerous criminals, as incompetent fools unfit to vote or hold office. One cartoon showed black politicians stealing chickens. Another showed black men as threatening figures looming over terrified white women. Day after day, the News and Observer pounded these images and these narratives into white readers' minds. Black people aren't your neighbors. Black people aren't your fellow citizens. Black people are threats to everything you hold dear. Daniels would later admit in his memoir Editor in Politics that the News and Observer was relied upon to carry the democratic message and to be the militant voice of white supremacy, and it did not fail in what was expected. He acknowledged his paper was occasionally excessive in its bias. He admitted some stories probably could not be sustained in a court of justice, but he never apologized. He never expressed regret. He never acknowledged that his propaganda campaign helped spark a massacre. After Wilmington, Josephus Daniels would go on to serve as Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson during World War I. He would serve as ambassador to Mexico under President Franklin Roosevelt. He would die in 1948, honored and respected, with buildings and schools named after him across North Carolina. His family would continue to own the News and Observer until 1995. Only in recent years have those buildings and schools been renamed as the truth about his role in 1898 has finally been acknowledged. The men who could speak included Charles Aycock and, crucially, Alfred Moore Waddell. Aycock would go on to become governor of North Carolina, campaigning on a platform of white supremacy while also promising universal education, though in practice that education would be segregated and grossly unequal. But in 1898, the most important voice was Waddell's. Alfred Moore Waddell was born on September 16, 1834, in Hillsborough, North Carolina. His lineage was impeccable by white Southern standards. He was descended from Revolutionary War generals Hugh Waddell and Francis Nash. He was descended from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Alfred Moore. He graduated from the University of North Carolina in 1853. He practiced law. During the Civil War, he served as a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate cavalry, fighting to preserve slavery. After the war, he edited a newspaper briefly, then entered politics, serving in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1871 to 1879 as a Democrat. But by 1898, Waddell's glory days were long behind him. He was 64 years old, unemployed, and struggling financially. His third wife, Gabrielle, had to support the family by teaching music lessons. For a man who prided himself on his distinguished ancestry and his service to the Confederacy, being dependent on his wife's income was humiliating. Waddell was bitter, resentful, looking for a way to reclaim relevance and power. The white supremacy campaign gave him that chance. The men who could ride were the red shirts. These weren't individual vigilantes or a spontaneous mob. The red shirts were an organized paramilitary group, modeled after the red shirts who had operated in South Carolina during earlier election campaigns to intimidate black voters. They called themselves red shirts because they wore red shirts as a uniform, making them instantly recognizable and adding to the intimidation factor. In the months leading up to the November election, red shirts would show up at Republican campaign rallies. They would ride through black neighborhoods firing guns in the air. They would gather outside black churches on Sunday mornings, a visible armed presence. The message was clear: vote Democratic or face consequences. Waddell would declare in one speech that the red shirts should gather 2 or 3 to every black voter at the polls, and if a black person tried to vote, the red shirts should force him to leave, and if he refused, the red shirts should kill him, should shoot him down in his tracks. This wasn't private talk. This wasn't something whispered in back rooms. These were public speeches, reported in newspapers, endorsed by Democratic Party leadership, met with cheers and applause from white audiences. Into this poisonous atmosphere of coordinated propaganda, inflammatory rhetoric, and paramilitary intimidation, Alex Manly published an editorial on August 18, 1898. For months, he had watched white newspapers across the South reprint Rebecca Felton's speech calling for black men to be lynched. He had watched the accusations pile up. He had listened to the whispers, then the shouts, that black men were predators threatening white women, that black political power meant danger for white families. And Alex Manly decided to tell the truth. His editorial in the Daily Record didn't deny that some crimes occurred. But it did something far more dangerous to white supremacist mythology. It exposed the hypocrisy. Manly wrote that white men needed to hear an uncomfortable truth. Tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for the white man to be intimate with a colored woman. You set yourselves down as a lot of carping hypocrites. In fact, you cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours. Manly pointed out what everyone knew but no one in white society would acknowledge. For over 200 years, white slave owners had raped black women with impunity. White men had fathered children with enslaved women, children who were then born into slavery, their fathers denying them, selling them, treating them as property. After the Civil War, this hadn't stopped. White men continued to pursue black women, sometimes through relationships that white society pretended didn't exist, sometimes through outright violence. Yet these same white men claimed to be horrified by the idea of a black man and a white woman in any kind of relationship. Manly also noted that many of the so-called black men accused of assaulting white women were actually biracial, men like himself, who had white fathers and black mothers. The black male predator narrative was selective outrage designed to justify violence, while ignoring generations of white male violence against black women. Manly was calling out the double standard. He was saying that if white people were truly concerned about violence and about protecting the virtue of women, they should look in the mirror. But of course, that wasn't what the hysteria was really about. It was about controlling black political power. It was about finding a justification for violence. The response to Manly's editorial was immediate and coordinated. White newspapers across North Carolina reprinted the editorial, but they didn't print it accurately. They distorted it. They claimed Manly had accused white women of willingly sleeping with black men. They claimed he had insulted white womanhood. They whipped readers into fury over words Manly hadn't actually written. The Wilmington Messenger, the white-owned rival newspaper in Wilmington, published a version of the editorial that made it sound far more offensive than the original. This wasn't accidental. The white supremacy campaign had been looking for a catalyst, a spark that would allow them to move from speeches and propaganda to direct action. Manly's editorial, deliberately misrepresented, gave them that spark. Across North Carolina, Democratic speakers referenced the editorial at every campaign stop. Vote for us, and we'll deal with Alex Manly. Vote for us, and we'll shut down that black newspaper that dared to speak back to white people. Vote for us, and we'll restore white supremacy. The editorial became the excuse, but it's crucial to understand that the violence was already planned. The conspiracy was already in motion. If Alex Manly hadn't published that editorial in August, the white supremacists would have found another excuse. On October 24, 1898, Alfred Moore Waddell spoke at Thalian Hall in Wilmington. Thalian Hall was a grand theater, opened in 1858, a beautiful building with ornate architecture where culture and refinement were supposedly celebrated. Now it hosted a speech dripping with violent intent. Waddell told the white audience that they needed to be prepared to take drastic action. He said they should be willing to choke the Cape Fear River with carcasses if that's what it took to restore white rule. The Cape Fear River flowed through Wilmington. Everyone in that audience understood what Waddell meant. He was talking about killing black people, throwing their bodies in the river, killing so many that the river would be clogged with corpses. The audience cheered. On November 7, 1898, the day before the election, Waddell was even more explicit. He gave another public speech where he told white men to go to the polls the next day, and if they found black people trying to vote, to tell them to leave the polls. And if those black voters refused to leave, Waddell said, "Kill him, shoot him down in his tracks." These weren't idle threats. These weren't exaggerations. This was incitement to murder, delivered as a campaign speech, reported in newspapers as if it were normal political rhetoric. Because in white supremacist North Carolina in 1898, it was normal. November 8th was Election Day. Armed red shirts positioned themselves at polling places across Wilmington. Black voters who tried to approach the polls were threatened, sometimes physically blocked. Ballot boxes were stuffed with Democratic votes. Republican ballots disappeared. The fraud was blatant, undeniable. Democrats won the election through terror and intimidation, not through legitimate votes. But even that victory wasn't enough. The fusionist government still controlled Wilmington's city government. Mayor Silas Wright, a white Republican, still held office. The Board of Aldermen, including its black members, still held office. City positions like treasurer, jailer, and coroner were still held by the men the fusionists had appointed. The next city elections weren't scheduled until March of 1899, 4 months away. The white supremacists had won control of the state legislature, but Wilmington's local government remained in the hands of the multiracial coalition they had campaigned against. They had already told their supporters that victory was coming. They had already promised that Wilmington would be redeemed. They couldn't wait 4 months. They wouldn't wait. So they planned a coup. On the afternoon of November 9th, 1898, at 3:50 in the afternoon, a group of black community leaders known as the Committee of Colored Citizens was summoned to a meeting. The list of names still exists in historical archives. These were ministers, businessmen, educators, respected figures who had spent their lives building Wilmington's black community. They were told they had to respond to an ultimatum by 7:30 the next morning. The ultimatum was contained in a document white leaders were calling the Wilmington Declaration of Independence. That evening, a mass meeting of white citizens was held. Accounts say hundreds attended. Waddell was elected chairman. He read aloud the Wilmington Declaration of Independence. The document demanded the immediate and permanent removal of the Daily Record and the permanent banishment of Alex Manly from North Carolina. It demanded that the Committee of Colored Citizens publicly endorse these demands. It demanded that black people in Wilmington accept that they had no right to political power, no right to hold office, no right to share in governance. The white citizens at that meeting appointed a committee of 25, armed white men who would enforce these demands. The Committee of Colored Citizens was given until 7:30 the next morning to deliver a written response accepting all terms. Everyone understood what would happen if that response wasn't delivered, or if it wasn't satisfactory. Violence was coming. That night, as word spread through Wilmington's black community about what was planned, Alex Manly faced an impossible choice. Staying meant almost certain death. The white supremacists had made clear that he was their primary target. They wanted him lynched. If the mob found him, there would be no trial, no due process, no appeal to law or justice. Alex Manly was 32 years old. He had built a successful newspaper from nothing. He had served his community. He had told the truth, or tried to. And now he had to run for his life. Accounts differ on exactly who helped him escape. Some sources say Thomas Clawson, the white editor of the rival Wilmington Messenger, gave Manly a passcode and money. Other historical records, including church histories from St. James Episcopal Church, say that Reverend Robert Strange personally escorted Manly from the city in his carriage. What we know for certain is that Manly's light skin saved his life. He was light enough to pass for white in the darkness, light enough that armed red shirts at roadblocks didn't immediately recognize him as the black newspaper editor they were hunting. His brother Frank escaped as well. The Daily Record would never publish another issue. Decades of almost all copies of the paper would be destroyed or lost. In 2019, researchers from an organization called the Third Person Project would finally locate a few surviving physical copies, the only ones known to still exist after 121 years. Almost every trace of the Daily Record had been systematically erased. As morning came on November 10, 1898, it became clear that the Committee of Colored Citizens wouldn't or couldn't deliver a response by the 7:30 deadline. By 9 in the morning, the white mob had assembled. 2,000 armed white men gathered with military precision. They had Winchesters, they had Colts, they had a Hotchkiss rapid-fire gun, a weapon that could fire over 400 rounds per minute. They marched from the armory on Market Street eastward toward 7th Street, then north to where the Daily Record building stood at the corner of 7th and Nunn. Witnesses described how organized they were, how calm, how methodical. They weren't a mob in the sense of chaos and random violence. They were an army executing a planned operation. When they reached the Daily Record building, they found it locked and empty. Alex Manly was gone. His brother was gone. The staff was gone. The armed white men broke down the door. They destroyed the printing press, smashing the machinery that had produced Wilmington's only black daily newspaper. They piled furniture, papers, everything flammable in the street. Then they set it all on fire. Flames rose into the November sky. Black smoke poured from the windows, and as the building burned, as democracy burned, as the First Amendment burned, the white mob posed for photographs. That photograph still exists today in the Library of Congress. 2,000 men, many of them smiling, standing in front of the smoking ruins of a newspaper they had just destroyed. But burning a newspaper wasn't enough to satisfy the mob. The white mob, energized by destroying the Daily Record, facing no resistance from police or military authorities, because those authorities were either sympathetic or actively participating, turned their weapons on Wilmington's black neighborhoods. They spread out through the city's northern sections where most black families lived. They entered homes without warrants, without cause. They entered churches. They shot black men in the streets. Black families fled in every direction. Some ran for the woods outside town. Some hid in Pine Forest Cemetery among the tombstones. Some fled into the surrounding swamps, wading into cold November water, trying to find places where they could hide until the violence passed. Parents carried children. Some families stayed in those swamps for 2 or 3 days, hiding, cold, wet, hungry, terrified. The very young and very old sometimes didn't survive the exposure. There are accounts of babies dying in their parents' arms while the family hid, parents having to muffle their own grief because crying out would reveal their location. How many people died on November 10th, 1898? The official coroner's count was 14 deaths. That number was clearly false. Modern historians estimate that as many as 60 black residents were killed that day, though some accounts suggest the toll may have reached into the hundreds. The truth is, we'll never know the real number. Many bodies were never recovered. Witnesses reported seeing white men throw corpses into the Cape Fear River. Other bodies were buried quickly in private yards. Still others may have been lost in the swamps. In recent years, historians have worked to identify as many victims as possible. Joshua Halsey's grave has been identified and marked. Samuel McFarland's grave has been identified and marked. But there are so many names we'll never know. While the violence raged in the streets, another operation was underway at City Hall. A group of armed white men marched to Wilmington's government offices. They found Mayor Silas P. Wright at his desk. The armed men presented Wright with a pre-typed letter of resignation. They told him to sign it. Wright looked at the rifles surrounding him. He understood that he had no choice. He signed. Every member of the Board of Aldermen was similarly forced to resign. By mid-afternoon on November 10th, Alfred Moore Waddell had been installed as the new mayor of Wilmington. He would serve in that position until 1906, never facing a legitimate election, having seized power through a coup. Behind Waddell stood the Secret Nine, the 9 wealthy white businessmen who had planned and funded the entire operation. J. Allen Taylor, president of the Wilmington Chamber of Commerce, was one of them. These weren't fringe extremists. These were the wealthiest and most powerful men in Wilmington, operating with support from the statewide Democratic Party leadership. Just 16 days after the coup, on November 26, 1898, Waddell published an article in Collier's Weekly magazine. The article was titled, "The Story of the Wilmington, North Carolina Race Riots." Notice that title. Race riots, not coup, not massacre, riots. Waddell's article portrayed what happened as a spontaneous uprising by white citizens who had been pushed too far by black arrogance. He portrayed himself as a reluctant leader. He claimed that black people had been secretly organizing violence. He claimed that the Daily Record had been publishing incitement. He rewrote history while the ashes were still warm. That article helped establish the narrative that would dominate for over a century. Textbooks would call it the Wilmington Race Riot. The blame would be placed on black residents. The coup would be erased. The conspiracy would be ignored. The massacre would be minimized. And the perpetrators would be celebrated as heroes. The coup's masterminds moved quickly to make their victory permanent. In 1899, less than a year after the massacre, a committee was formed to draft amendments to North Carolina's state constitution. The chairman was George Roundtree, an attorney who had advised the coup leaders. The committee drafted what became known as the Grandfather Clause. The amendment required voters to pass a literacy test and pay a poll tax before they could vote. But anyone whose grandfather had been eligible to vote before 1867 was exempted. Since black people had been enslaved and unable to vote before that date, the grandfather clause effectively stripped black people of voting rights while protecting white voting rights. It was Jim Crow enshrined in the state constitution. Other southern states copied North Carolina's model. By 1900, black political power had been systematically dismantled across the South through violence, fraud, and constitutional manipulation. The impact on Wilmington was catastrophic and permanent. Before the coup, black residents had made up 56% of the city's population. After the coup, with over 2,100 having fled and many more leaving in subsequent years, the demographic balance shifted permanently. Black businesses closed. Black professionals relocated. The black middle class that had been building for decades was shattered. Black literacy rates, which had exceeded white literacy rates before the coup, plummeted as schools lost funding. Today, black residents make up less than 15% of Wilmington's population. An entire community's achievements, generations of work and sacrifice, were erased in a single day, and the effects still echo today. What happened to Alex Manly? He eventually reached Washington, D.C., where he found shelter with Congressman George Henry White, the only black member of Congress at the time. On July 25, 1900, Alex Manly married Caroline Sajwar in Washington. Caroline was a graduate of Fisk University and had been a member of the famous Fisk Jubilee Singers. After the wedding, Alex and Frank moved to Philadelphia, where they would spend the rest of their lives. Alex found work as a professional painter and remained involved in journalism and civil rights activism. He helped establish the Armstrong Association, which would later evolve into the National Urban League. He became a leader in the Afro-American Newspaper Council. Alex Manly never returned to Wilmington. He died in Pennsylvania on October 5, 1944, at the age of 78. In the 1950s, Caroline wrote letters to their two sons describing what their father's life had been like, what he had built in Wilmington, what might have been if the coup hadn't forced him into exile. Those letters survive as a reminder that historical trauma doesn't end when the direct victims die. It echoes through families and communities for generations. For over a century, the Wilmington coup of 1898 was successfully reframed as a race riot. History books called it a riot. The blame was placed on black residents. The conspiracy was ignored. The massacre was minimized. The perpetrators were celebrated. Schools and buildings were named after the coup's leaders. Only in the 1950s did some historians start questioning the narrative. But it wasn't until the centennial in 1998 that momentum built to uncover the truth. In 2000, the North Carolina General Assembly authorized the creation of the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot Commission. The commission spent 6 years conducting research. In 2006, they released their final report. The report was 500 pages long. It concluded that what happened in Wilmington was not a riot. It was a coup and a massacre. It was a planned overthrow of a legitimately elected government. It was racial terrorism designed to strip black people of political power. The death toll was officially estimated at as many as 60, though the report acknowledged the true number was probably higher and might never be known. For the first time, the state of North Carolina officially acknowledged what had happened. The work of recovering history continues. In 2008, the 1898 Memorial Park was dedicated in Wilmington. Researchers continue working to identify all the victims. Joshua Halsey and Samuel McFarland have had their graves identified and marked. In 2020 and 2021, a wave of renamings swept North Carolina. Buildings and schools named after Josephus Daniels were renamed. Buildings named after Charles Aycock were renamed. Buildings named after other white supremacist leaders involved in the coup were renamed. Students had pushed for these changes for years, arguing that honoring white supremacists sent a message that the state valued white supremacy more than truth. Finally, over a century late, those names came down. In 2024, PBS released a documentary titled American Coup, Wilmington 1898, bringing the story to a national audience. Why does the Wilmington coup still matter today? Because it reveals truths about American democracy that we still struggle to acknowledge. 2,000 armed white men overthrew an elected government in broad daylight, massacred as many as 60 black residents, drove over 2,000 more into permanent exile, and succeeded in stripping black political power from an entire region for generations. They did it openly. They posed for photographs. They published articles celebrating their actions. They faced no federal consequences, no military intervention, no prosecutions. Not a single person was arrested. Not a single person went to trial. Not a single person was held accountable. The perpetrators were celebrated as heroes. The victims were blamed. For over a century, textbooks lied about what happened. For over a century, the truth was suppressed so successfully that most Americans had never heard the story. The Wilmington coup shows how quickly democracy can be destroyed when powerful people decide they don't want to share power. When they decide that certain people voting and holding office is intolerable. When they decide violence is justified to maintain their dominance. The burning of the Daily Record wasn't just an attack on one newspaper. It was an attack on truth itself, on the idea that black voices had the right to challenge white power, on the possibility of multiracial democracy in America. Alex Manly's editorial didn't cause the coup. It provided a pretext for violence that white supremacists had been planning for months. But the symbolism mattered. The first target, before any person was killed, before the government was overthrown, was a black newspaper. Destroy the press. Control the narrative. Rewrite history. For over 100 years, it worked. The Daily Record advertised itself as the only Negro daily in the world. For 3 years, Alex and Frank Manly published that paper, providing news and commentary and a voice for Wilmington's black residents. On November 10th, 1898, a mob burned it to the ground. Nearly every copy was destroyed. For 121 years, only fragments remained. Then, in 2019, the Third Person Project found surviving copies, actual physical newspapers that had somehow escaped destruction. Holding those papers today, seeing the actual print, connects us across time to what was lost. Today, visitors to Wilmington can walk to the corner of 7th and Nunn Streets. A different building stands there now. There's no historical marker at the exact spot where the Daily Record once operated, though the Memorial Park stands nearby. You can visit Thalian Hall, where Waddell gave his speeches threatening to choke the river with corpses. The building is still there, still beautiful, carrying within its walls the memory of words that incited murder. You can visit the university archives where researchers work to recover every detail, every name, every story. You can meet descendants who carry this history in their DNA, whose ancestors fled with nothing, who grew up hearing family stories about the coup even when textbooks denied it happened. You can see how history shapes the present, how the demographic shift caused by the coup still defines the city's population, how the economic devastation inflicted on Wilmington's black community in 1898 ripples forward through generations of lost wealth, lost opportunity, lost political power. The Wilmington coup of 1898 remains the only successful coup d'etat on American soil. It succeeded in destroying black political power, but it failed to erase the truth forever. More than 125 years later, we finally know what happened. Not a race riot, a coup, a massacre. The murder of democracy itself, and the newspaper that dared to tell the truth. Every name matters, every story matters. The families who hid in swamps while babies died in their arms matter. The black police officers forced from their jobs matter. The black aldermen forced to resign at gunpoint matter. The 2,100 people who fled matter. The newspaper that was burned matters. And the truth, finally being told after more than a century, matters most of all. Because if we can't tell the truth about our history, if we can't acknowledge what was done and by whom and why, then we can't understand the present, and we certainly can't build a more just future. The Daily Record is gone, but its story lives on. And in that story is a warning and a lesson. Democracy is fragile. Truth is fragile. Both require constant protection. Both can be destroyed if people of conscience don't defend them. Both can be recovered, even after a century of lies, if people commit to telling the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. The burning of the Daily Record in 1898 was an attempt to silence black voices permanently. That it took over a century to recover the truth shows how well that silencing worked. But the fact that we're finally telling this story, that researchers are finding every victim's name, that descendants are working together to honor the past honestly, that buildings named for coup leaders are being renamed, that documentaries are being made and books are being written and students are learning what really happened, shows that truth, however long suppressed, eventually emerges. It emerges because people refuse to let it die. It emerges because the voices that were silenced demand to be heard across time. It emerges because democracy, however fragile, however vulnerable to violence and lies, carries within it the seeds of its own recovery. The coup succeeded for a century, but truth wins in the end. That's what the story of the Daily Record teaches us. That's what the story of Alex Manly teaches us. That's what the story of Wilmington, 1898 teaches us. Tell the truth. Remember the names. Never forget what was done. Never stop fighting for justice. And never, ever take democracy for granted. Because as Wilmington proved, it can be destroyed in a single morning. But as Wilmington also proves, it can be remembered, honored, and perhaps, someday, rebuilt. Standing at the corner of 7th and Nunn Streets today, you would never know that this quiet intersection was once the center of a hurricane that changed American history. The building is gone. The newspaper is gone. Most of the people who lived through that day are gone. But the memory remains, preserved now in archives and memorial parks, and in the work of historians who refuse to let the story die. The photograph of 2,000 men posing in front of the burning building still exists in the Library of Congress, a permanent record of American democracy being murdered. That photograph tells us something important. The perpetrators weren't ashamed. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their grandchildren to know what they had done and to be proud. For a century, that's exactly what happened.